I bought my beach house to finally breathe without someone else's expectations sitting on my chest. 3 days after moving in, my father showed up, uninvited, with 2 suitcases, a locksmith, and the kind of confidence that said he believed my front door already belonged to him. Subscribe only if you believe peace means nothing unless you're willing to defend it when someone tries to take it from you. My name's Danielle Carter, and for most of my life, my independence was treated like a temporary condition, not something I owned, something I borrowed. I was the responsible one, the stable one, the one who could handle things, and in my family, that didn't mean admiration. It meant availability. When my dad's contracting business collapsed 8 years ago, I was the one who helped cover the mortgage. When my stepmother had surgery, I handled the medical bills. When my half-brother needed tuition, I took out a loan in my own name. Every time, I told myself it was temporary, just until things stabilized. But stability never came. Dependence did. And the worst part? It didn't feel like theft. It felt like duty, because my dad never demanded directly. He framed everything as necessity, as survival, as something good daughters understood without needing to be asked. So when I quit my high-pressure marketing job last year, burned out to the point where my hands shook every morning before work, I didn't announce it. I didn't explain. I just left. And I took what little savings I had left and bought something no one expected. Not an investment, not an upgrade, a boundary, a modest beach house 3 states away. The place wasn't flashy, weathered deck, wide windows, salt-stained railings, but the first night I slept there, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt safe. No late-night calls asking for help, no guilt-loaded check-ins, no casual conversations that somehow ended with me solving someone else's crisis. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me. That lasted 72 hours. The knock came early, too firm to be a neighbor, too deliberate to be casual. When I opened the door, my father stood there, and behind him, a locksmith, and on the ground, 2 full suitcases, not overnight bags, not visiting luggage, relocation. The locksmith avoided my eyes. My father didn't. He smiled like this was inevitable. "Morning, Danny," he said. My throat tightened. "How did you find me?" He shrugged. "You think you're hard to track down?" Translation, privacy wasn't something he recognized. "I called you," he continued. "You didn't answer." I hadn't seen a single missed call. Then he nodded toward the locksmith, "Just here in case." In case. The words were light. The meaning wasn't. My brain split into 2 timelines. One, step aside, avoid escalation, keep peace. The other, this is exactly what you left to escape. And something inside me, something tired of shrinking, refused to default. "What are you doing here?" I asked. My father gestured toward the house like he was discussing logistics. "I'm staying for a while." Not asking, informing. The locksmith shifted his stance slightly, ready, prepared, like this wasn't a visit, it was implementation. "I didn't talk to me about that," I said. His smile faded slightly, not angry yet, just surprised, like gravity had shifted without warning. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. You've got space." There it was, the equation. Your stability equals shared resource. Your peace equals family solution. Your home equals overflow capacity. The ocean behind me rolled steadily onto the shore, unconcerned, unmoved, unapologetic, and for the first time, I didn't step aside. Instead, I said calmly, "You can come in." Relief flickered across his face. Victory assumed. He motioned toward the locksmith. "Not him," I added. The man froze. My father hesitated. Then curiosity outweighed certainty. He stepped inside alone, and as the door closed behind him, something shifted. Because he thought he had just secured temporary refuge, he hadn't. Realized he'd walked into a space where the rules were no longer his. The instant the door clicked shut behind him, the tension in the room became tangible, like static in the air just before a storm. My father's confidence, so carefully rehearsed before arrival, faltered slightly. He was stepping into a reality he hadn't anticipated. My house, my rules, my boundaries. Everything he assumed he could ignore now pressed back at him silently. I leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely, calm, measured, deliberate. "You've got space here," he said, almost conversationally. "I'll need to use the back room. It'll be easier to take calls." I didn't flinch. Not this time. Not like I used to. "You'll need to stay where I say, under my terms." His brow furrowed. That familiar shift in posture, the first crack in the armor, appeared. "Terms?" he repeated slowly. "I'm your father. I shouldn't have to. And yet, you thought you could just bring a locksmith and move in, like this was expected, like my life is a revolving door for your convenience." The words hit harder than any shouting match could have. His jaw tightened. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No retort came. He wasn't used to confrontation where he couldn't dominate. "You've been doing this your whole life," I said, sliding a folder across the table toward him. "Managing everyone else's needs, paying the bills, holding the family together, all at the cost of your own peace." He glanced at the folder, but didn't open it. I took a deep breath. "I've documented it. Every transfer, every loan, every emergency I covered. Every time you assumed my silence meant consent. Everything is here." For the first time, his expression faltered. Disbelief replaced confidence. The man who had controlled the narrative for decades was staring at evidence he couldn't argue away. "Donnie," he said quietly, "you're being extreme." "No," I replied evenly. "I'm being clear. I'm setting boundaries. You don't get to erase my life because you think it belongs to you." He looked down at the folder, then back at me. The first real uncertainty crept into his posture. He had planned a takeover. He hadn't prepared for resistance that was calm, precise, and immovable. "And your stepmother?" I asked. "She booked a flight, assuming she'd be staying too. I imagine she'll be surprised when she gets the call." He hesitated. Now the cracks widened. His grip on control was slipping, and he didn't like it. He ran a hand over his face. She's just trying to help." Defense creeping into his voice now. I smiled faintly. "By taking over my home? No, that's not help. That's assumption. That's entitlement." He exhaled slowly, pacing the room. The air between us grew heavier with every passing second. He hadn't yet realized that I wasn't reacting emotionally, because I didn't need to. My calm composure made him doubt his strategy, question his choices, and question his right to even be there. I opened a second folder, thinner this one, and slid it in front of him. A formal short-term occupancy agreement, his name printed at the top, conditions outlined, duration defined, respect clauses, consequences clearly stated. He froze. The pen in his hand wavered. You're serious," he said, disbelief lacing every syllable. "Yes," I said. "If you want to stay, it will be on my terms. Temporary, conditional, respectful. And if you don't agree, you leave." His lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the old frustration beginning to mix with the first real signs of reflection. This isn't fair." Fair. Always the go-to word. His comfort defined fairness for decades, not mine. "No," I said softly. "Fair is irrelevant here. Consent is relevant. Respect is relevant. That's what this is about." He looked down at the agreement again. Then he glanced at the doorway where the locksmith had paused, a quiet observer of the tension he had been part of creating. For the first time, he realized that his assumption of compliance had consequences he hadn't accounted for. Minutes passed. He didn't move, didn't sign, didn't leave, just processed. Outside, the waves rolled forward without apology. The wind pushed through the open windows. The natural world didn't negotiate, and neither did I. Then a quiet buzz. His phone. Stepmother. His expression changed slightly. I could see the stress of expectation collide with reality. "She thinks this will be simple," he muttered, almost to himself. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. He was realizing slowly that simplicity isn't a birthright. It must be earned. "I'll stay," he said finally, "under your terms. Not easily, not joyfully, not as a concession to virtue, but as an acknowledgement, recognition that his previous assumptions didn't apply here, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to step into someone else's world on their conditions. Even then, he wasn't relieved, just aware. "You really mean this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. And for the first time since he stepped on my property, he hesitated, not in arrogance, but in calculation. He realized his usual methods would no longer work, his authority no longer automatic. And that hesitation, that was victory.
The house felt different after that first confrontation, not because my father had technically agreed, but because the balance of power had shifted. Every step he took now had to navigate boundaries he had ignored for decades. Even the air seemed heavier, charged with the tension of a battle neither of us had yet fully defined. He stayed standing in the kitchen, looking at the 2 folders I'd placed on the table. His brow was furrowed, eyes flicking between documents, the ocean outside, and me. The flicker of doubt in his posture was tiny but unmistakable. He had never hesitated like this, not in my life, not in arguments, not in family gatherings where his word was law. "I still don't understand why you're doing this," he said finally. His voice was quieter than usual, brittle. "I'm your father. I shouldn't need to be asked to stay in a house." I didn't flinch. I had rehearsed this, not with words alone, but with years of practice in standing still, in holding space without retreating. "Because this is my house," I said calmly, "and my life, and you've spent decades deciding it belonged to you whenever it was convenient. That ends now." He exhaled sharply, pacing slowly. The old method of control, asserting dominance, commanding compliance, was failing him for the first time. It was visible in the way he hesitated near the window, the way his hands trembled slightly when he ran them over his face. Not physical fear, but the fear of losing authority, of realizing it was no longer absolute. And then came the second wave of pressure, the one I had anticipated. His phone buzzed again. Stepmother. He answered briefly, her voice tight with expectation. "I can't just—" "No," he muttered. The words were clipped, reluctant. The conversation seemed brief, urgent, full of the kind of tension that comes when someone realizes their assumptions were wrong. He ended the call with a glance at me that was both frustrated and uncertain. "She's expecting to stay here," he admitted quietly. "She thought it'd be simple." I folded my arms. Simple is not how my life works, and neither is assumption. She'll need to accept the rules if she's coming, or cancel her plans. He rubbed his forehead, muttering under his breath. For the first time, the person who had always been a constant force in my life, commanding, entitled, dismissive, looked genuinely constrained. He had no easy path forward, no automatic compliance, no way to bend the situation to his will without consequences. I could see him wrestling internally, authority versus reality, assumption versus consent, habit versus accountability. He wanted to push, to argue, to reclaim the narrative, but every instinct that would normally work against me now risked humiliation or outright failure. Finally, he exhaled slowly and looked at the second folder, the short-term occupancy agreement. It was concise, formal, unambiguous, conditions clearly laid out. He picked up the pen, hesitated, and then set it down. His body language shifted, frustration softened into reflection. "This is extreme," he said finally, voice tight. "No, it's necessary," I replied evenly. "You came here uninvited. You assumed. That's the behavior I'm correcting. Not you personally, your behavior, and it ends now." He paced again, slow and deliberate, finally moving toward the back room where he would be staying. "I suppose I can follow your rules," he muttered. Not a concession, not an apology, just acknowledgement that resistance would be fruitless. Then the locksmith knocked lightly on the doorframe, a silent reminder of the escalation he had initiated. I ignored it. My father glanced at the man, then shook his head and waved him off. That small act, refusing the locksmith's intervention, was symbolic. He was already learning the lesson I had prepared him to learn. My house, my rules, my terms. Minutes passed in silence. My father remained tense, pacing occasionally, adjusting to the fact that control no longer resided with him. Finally, he turned to me. "You've changed," he said quietly. Not accusatory, observational, almost hesitant. "No," I replied evenly. "I stopped pretending. I stopped bending to assumptions. I'm not the same person you raised." That realization hung in the air. He didn't argue, didn't try to reclaim the old dynamic. Not yet. The tension wasn't gone. It was compressed, focused, and real. Then came a subtle shift in tone, a glimmer of compliance. Not agreement, not defeat, just awareness. "I'll stay," he said finally, "for now, under your conditions." "Yes," I replied. And it was enough, not because he had given in, but because the boundaries were now enforced, the space no longer negotiable. But even in that small victory, I knew the story wasn't over. His stepmother's visit was pending, the pressure wasn't finished, and the lesson I intended to deliver was not complete until both of them understood this was my life, my home, and no assumption, no entitlement, no family history could rewrite that. The ocean outside continued its rhythm, indifferent to human conflict, and I let it anchor me, calm, steady, unyielding. For the first time, I understood something crucial. Power wasn't about yelling, forcing, or demanding. It was about being immovable, prepared, and ready to enforce boundaries with quiet precision. And my father, finally confronted by someone who wouldn't flinch, was learning that lesson in real time.
The next morning, the calm of the beach house felt fragile but charged, like the air before a summer storm. My father was still pacing the living room, reviewing the short-term occupancy agreement again, a furrow in his brow that hadn't been there before. For the first time, I could see him processing something deeper than anger or entitlement. Realization. "Stepmom called again," he muttered under his breath. His voice had that tense edge now, the one that comes from someone suddenly aware that the world doesn't bend to their will. "She thinks I'm exaggerating." I didn't respond. I let him stew, let the discomfort settle in. He had assumed for decades that silence would mean compliance. Not here, not now. Then the front door opened before I had time to react, and her presence struck like a second wave. My stepmother strode in, suitcase in hand, eyes wide with expectation. "Danny, we assumed you'd be okay with this." I folded my arms, calm, still, imposing without threat. "Assumptions aren't part of this house," I said. "If you're staying, it's under the terms my father agreed to yesterday." Her mouth opened and closed several times. Surprise, disbelief, frustration, confusion, a cocktail I had anticipated. "Terms? What terms?" she demanded, her voice louder than necessary. I nodded toward the folders on the table. "Occupancy agreement, duration, boundaries, respect clauses, signed by your husband." She blinked, then stared at him. You signed this?" He nodded, a little stiffly, the first real sign that he understood my boundaries was not in my words, but in his acknowledgement of them. The locksmith shifted his weight in the doorway, quietly observing the unfolding scene. His role, initially an intimidating presence, was now a testament to the threat that had never needed execution. He didn't interfere, he merely reminded everyone in the room of the stakes they had ignored. She can't do this," my stepmother said, voice rising. "This is your daughter. You can't force her to—" I cut her off with a level gaze. Calm, still, imposing without threat. "No one is forcing anyone. I'm asking for consent, respect. You can accept the terms or leave. That's it." The shock on both their faces was tangible. My father's jaw tightened. He hadn't anticipated her reaction. For the first time, he saw the consequences of assumptions, his and hers. I need to think," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He took a step back, finally giving me space, finally allowing me to occupy the authority I had earned. Minutes dragged as the tension filled the room. Stepmother shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her entitlement crashing into the immovable wall of my rules. Finally, she huffed and flopped into a chair, muttering about inconvenience. My father sighed, leaning against the counter. She's upset," he said quietly, almost defensively. "Yes," I replied softly, And that's the point. Boundaries create discomfort when they haven't been respected before. You've been taught to ignore them. Now you're learning otherwise. He looked at me, a flicker of respect in his eyes, mixed with lingering frustration. "You've changed," he admitted. I stopped pretending. A long silence settled. The ocean outside rolled forward steadily, indifferent to human conflict. The house, my sanctuary, had become a proving ground. It had already proven one thing: autonomy, when enforced consistently, cannot be assumed away. Stepmother finally stood, dragging her suitcase toward the door. I'll figure something else out," she muttered. Her previous certainty had been dismantled by a house that refused assumptions. My father followed her gaze. He didn't protest, he didn't argue, he just acknowledged the reality we had created together. For the first time in decades, he realized that control was not inherent, it had to be earned, and it could be lost. The locksmith, quiet observer until now, picked up his tools and left, not dramatic, not silent, just an exclamation point on the threat that had been neutralized without confrontation. Once the door closed, I exhaled slowly, stepping onto the deck, barefoot, salt air brushing my skin. The house was quiet again, but this time the calm felt earned, defended, not borrowed, not temporary, solid. I watched the horizon, the waves rolling forward, unstoppable and unapologetic, and for the first time I let myself smile, not the anxious, fragile grin of someone who fears intrusion, but the full, unrestrained one of someone who has reclaimed her life. Some victories are loud, chaotic, cinematic. Mine was silent, precise, undeniable. Not revenge, not humiliation, not rage, but consequence delivered with clarity. I knew my father and stepmother would remember this lesson for a long time, not because of shouting, not because of drama, but because boundaries once enforced are impossible to ignore. And the house, my rules, my life, unquestionable. For the first time, the peace I had imagined for years wasn't just a fantasy, it was real, defended, and untouchable. I stepped back inside, ready to live finally without apology or intrusion, the ocean humming quietly behind me like a witness to everything I had claimed.